The door to Raphael Voss's office didn't close so much as seal, a soft, pressurized click that swallowed the noise of the 42nd floor hole. Nadia Okafor had worked in that silence for 3 years. She knew the particular weight of it at 7 in the morning, when the cleaning crew had just left and the espresso machine in the corner was still warming up. She knew it at midnight when the city below threw pale light against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Raphael was still at his desk, jacket long discarded, sleeves rolled to the elbow, going through acquisition files like a man who had never learned to stop. She knew every mood of that silence, the way you come to know a country you were never meant to live in. What she had counted on was wearing the burgundy dress on a Tuesday. It wasn't even a decision. Not really. Her dry cleaning had been delayed. Something about a faulty machine at the shop on King Street, and the burgundy dress was the only thing hanging in her office closet that wasn't a blazer or a spare pair of slacks kept there for emergencies. It was a good dress. A dinner party dress, technically. Jersey fabric, wrap style, deep color that suited her dark complexion. It fit the way clothes rarely fit her, across the shoulders, across the chest, across the generous curve of her hips. It was appropriate. It was professional. It was, objectively, just a dress. Raphael Voss did not seem to agree. He arrived at 8:14, which was late for him and early for anyone else. He came through the main doors the way he always did, without looking up from his phone, coat over one arm, already talking to someone on an earpiece about a shipping delay out of Halifax. Nadia was at the credenza pouring his coffee. She heard him go quiet, not pause, quiet. The difference was significant. She turned around and found him standing 6 feet away, coat still over his arm, phone call apparently forgotten, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Raphael Voss had many expressions in his repertoire. Impatience, calculation, the thin, courteous smile he deployed in meetings with people he was about to ruin. Occasionally with her, something that resembled actual warmth, though it passed quickly, and he never acknowledged it. This was none of those. "That's not your usual," he said. His voice was careful. That was unusual, too. Nadia set down the coffee carafe. "Dry cleaning issue. It won't happen again." "I didn't say it was a problem. You implied it." I asked a factual question. She looked at him steadily. "You said that's not your usual in a tone that suggested a court summons." Something moved behind his eyes. He set his coat on the chair nearest the door, which he never did. He always hung it in the closet, and crossed to his desk without another word. But twice, in the next 10 minutes, while Nadia went through the morning briefing, and he was supposed to be reading the overnight reports, she caught him looking. Not at her face. At her, all of her, and then away. She didn't mention it. She had learned over 3 years that most things in Raphael Voss's orbit were better left unmentioned until they became impossible to ignore. She was beginning to suspect this would become impossible to ignore. Nadia Okafor had come to Voss Capital Group the way most people came to jobs that changed their lives, through a side door at the wrong time, for reasons that had nothing to do with ambition. She'd grown up in Ottawa, the youngest daughter of a Nigerian-Canadian economist and a Quebecois nurse who had met at a conference in Montreal in 1987 and had immediately, according to family legend, argued for 40 minutes about monetary policy before either of them thought to ask each other's names. Nadia had inherited her father's facility with numbers and her mother's refusal to soften an opinion for anyone's comfort. What she had not inherited, at least according to the world's general consensus, was the right body type for the career she'd chosen. Finance, she had learned early, had a particular image in mind. It was angular. It wore clothes that cost $3,000 and looked like they cost less. It did not, generally speaking, look like Nadia. 5'4", full-figured in the way that made tailors sigh, with the kind of face that people described as striking when they meant they hadn't decided yet whether they found her beautiful. She had a master's degree in financial risk analysis from Queen's University and had spent 4 years at a mid-sized investment firm in Toronto before a restructuring left her department dissolved and her career suddenly theoretical. She'd taken the contract position at Voss Capital Group as a stopgap. That had been 3 years ago. The stopgap had, somewhere along the way, become a foundation. What she hadn't anticipated was Raphael himself. He was, by any reasonable measure, a difficult man. 41, the kind of handsome that came from bone structure and discipline rather than luck, with grey eyes that processed information the way a blade processes resistance. He had built Voss Capital Group from a regional private equity firm into something that moved quietly through the upper levels of Canadian finance like a current beneath still water. Not flashy, not loud, but everything in its path eventually went where it directed. He did not suffer inefficiency, vagueness, or the particular brand of performative competence that passed for intelligence in most boardrooms. He had gone through 3 executive assistants in the 2 years before Nadia arrived. She had lasted 3 years because she was better at her job than anyone else in the building, and because she had, from the first week, refused to pretend otherwise. What had remained unspoken, in the space between professional and something else, was harder to account for. She filed it under irrelevant. She was good at that. She was beginning to be less good at it. The Carrington Group arrived on a Wednesday. They came in the form of 2 men from Vancouver, Philippe Rousseau, Senior Acquisitions Director, broad-shouldered and aggressively pleasant, in the way of people who had been told their whole lives that charm was a strategy, and a financial analyst named Sébastien Leroy, who said very little and watched everything. They were there to negotiate a partnership that Raphael had been cautiously considering for 6 months, a coastal logistics network that would give Voss Capital a new corridor into Pacific trade. It was, by any measure, significant. Nadia had prepared the briefing materials. She had also, because she was Nadia, prepared a secondary analysis that nobody had asked for. A quiet examination of 3 anomalies in the Carrington Group's reported customs clearance rates at BC ports. Anomalies that didn't announce themselves, but that, if you looked at the right columns in the right sequence, suggested something was running beneath the legitimate operation like a second river beneath the first. She had not yet decided what to do with this information. She left the binders on Raphael's desk at 7:45, before anyone arrived, and went to set up the boardroom. Philippe Rousseau found her there at 8:55 minutes before the meeting, adjusting the presentation on the screen. "You must be the assistant," he said, in a tone that placed the word assistant on a lower shelf than she intended to occupy. "Financial operations coordinator," Nadia said pleasantly. "Can I get you anything before we start?" Actually, he stepped closer than was strictly necessary. "I was hoping to talk to someone who knows how Raphael runs his due diligence process, specifically the international side. Partner verification, that sort of thing." It was smoothly done. She'd give him that. "That would be a conversation for after the agreement is signed," she said, "and even then it would go through legal." He smiled. "Of course, just making conversation." He was not just making conversation. She noted it. She noted the way Leroy had glanced up from his phone when Rousseau walked over. She noted that neither of them had asked her name. She sat at the far end of the table, opened her laptop, and began updating her secondary analysis with the specifics questions they had just accidentally confirmed she should be asking. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Raphael was precise and measured throughout, the way he always was in rooms where he'd already decided the outcome, and was simply collecting evidence to confirm it. Twice he glanced at Nadia. Not for anything specific. She wasn't presenting, wasn't speaking. Just a quick check, the kind a person makes when they want to know if someone else in the room has noticed what they've noticed. She gave him the smallest nod. His expression didn't change, but his pen stilled briefly on the page in front of him. Afterward, when the Carrington delegation had been shown to the elevator by Raphael's associate and the boardroom was quiet, Raphael stayed at the table. Nadia was collecting binders from the opposite end. "What did Rousseau want?" he said. It wasn't a question. "He asked about your international due diligence process, specifically partner verification." A silence, And you said, I said it would go through legal post-signing. She set the binders on the cart. But I think we both know there isn't going to be a signing. He looked at her steadily. Show me what you found. She opened her laptop and turned it toward him. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which meant he was recalibrating. She knew that look too. 3 ports, he said finally. 4, if you include Prince Rupert. The Prince Rupert one is subtler. How long have you had this? Since Monday. I wanted to verify before I brought it forward. I didn't want to bring you a theory. He looked at her. There was something in it she couldn't entirely categorize. Something between respect and something rawer than respect. Something he didn't seem entirely prepared for himself. Nadia, he said, and her name in his mouth had always sounded different than it did anywhere else. She had simply refused to examine why. This would have cost us considerably. I know. Why didn't you come to me immediately? Because, she said, precisely, I wanted to be right before I walked into your office and told you that a deal you've spent 6 months building is a door someone is trying to use to access your customs contacts. He said nothing. Then, quietly, you were right. I usually am, she said, and picked up the binder cart and left before either of them could say anything else. The call came at 9:43 that night. She was at home in her apartment on Sherborne Street, in the oversized cardigan she wore when she wasn't performing competence for anyone, eating leftover dal and reading a report on cross-border securities regulation, which was, in fact, leisure reading for her. Her phone showed a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway, Mrs. Okafor, not Rousseau. Someone else, older voice, careful diction, the particular flatness of someone who had learned English as a second or third language, and had since become more precise in it than most native speakers. My name is not important. What is important is that you pulled documents today that were not meant to be found. She set down her fork. I think you have the wrong number, she said. I don't believe that's true. A pause. We understand you are skilled. We are not asking you to be unskilled. We are asking you to look away from what you found and to persuade your employer to proceed with the Carrington Agreement. And if I don't, another pause, longer. We know where you work, the voice said. We know you take the King streetcar on Tuesdays. We know you order from the Thai place on Parliament every Friday. We know considerably more than you'd be comfortable with. The line went dead. Nadia sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her laptop, opened a new encrypted document, and began writing down every detail of the call she could remember. Cadence, vocabulary, the precise wording of each phrase. She did this before she allowed herself to feel afraid, because fear could come after. But information deteriorated quickly. She finished the document. She sat with the fear for exactly 3 minutes. Then she made a decision. She called Raphael. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd still been awake, which was, she supposed, not surprising. Someone just threatened me, she said. In connection with the Carrington files. I need to know if your building has a secure line. A beat of silence. Don't go anywhere, he said. His voice had gone very quiet, the way it went quiet when something had his full attention. I'm sending a car. His apartment was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. It was in the St. Lawrence neighborhood, a converted warehouse building with high ceilings and exposed brick, and a studied lack of the ostentatious luxury she'd assumed wealth of his level would require. Books, mostly. A good sound system, currently silent. A kitchen that looked used. He was in a grey shirt and dark trousers, no jacket, which was the most undone she had ever seen him. He looked, she realized, like a person, which seemed like a strange thing to notice about someone she'd worked with for 3 years, but there it was. He poured her tea without asking if she wanted it, which she found unreasonably, almost unbearably kind. She gave him the document. He read it twice. They've been watching you, he said. Apparently, how long, I don't know. Long enough to know my routine. He set the document down. Something had changed in his face. A tightening around the eyes, a quality she'd seen in boardrooms but aimed at balance sheets and adversaries, not at the space above her head where he was currently directing it. "This is my fault," he said. "It isn't. You were collateral in something I should have moved faster on. I've had questions about Carrington for 3 months. I should have pulled the thread harder." "I pulled the thread," she said. "I should have come to you Monday. You were being careful." "Yes." He looked at her then directly, and for a moment the thing that had been living in the corners of rooms between them for 3 years was simply present, unhidden, too large to politely ignore. "You should have told me," he said. His voice was different now. Not the boardroom voice, not even the late-night office voice. Something she hadn't heard before. Not because it was protocol, because he stopped, started again. "You work for me. Your safety is my responsibility. I work with you," she said quietly. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "There is." She drank her tea. He sat across from her and didn't look away, and she let him not look away, which was its own kind of answer. By Thursday morning, Nadia had rebuilt the entire Carrington file from a different angle. She'd slept 3 hours on Raphael's couch. He'd offered her the guest room. She'd declined, citing the impracticality of being further from the door in a situation where she wasn't certain of her security, and had used the rest of the night to trace the customs anomalies backward through 6 years of port records, cross-referencing publicly available shipping manifests with the Carrington Group's declared revenue. What emerged was not a smuggling operation in the obvious sense. It was more sophisticated than that, a shell network rotating using legitimate trade volume as a kind of camouflage, with Voss Capital Group positioned, in the Carrington plan, to become the most respectable layer of cover they'd ever managed to acquire. She printed it out, 47 pages. Raphael found her at the kitchen table at 6 a.m., reading it for the 3rd time. He'd brought 2 coffees. He set one in front of her without a word and looked at the stack of pages. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept. Nadia, 3 hours is technically sleep." He sat down. He looked at the pages, then at her. "How long have you been able to do this?" She looked up. "Do what? See these things, the patterns, the threads that don't align." She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Since I was about 11, my father would bring home economic reports, and I'd read them, and I'd find things that didn't add up. He thought I was just being contrary." A pause. "I was being contrary, but I was also right." Something moved across his face, something genuine and unguarded. "I've had 3 risk analysts in this building for 5 years, he said, "and not one of them found what you found in 72 hours. They're looking at what they're told to look at," she said. "I look at what's beside it." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have." He stopped. Should have what? He shook his head. Not evasively, it looked more like someone rearranging a thought that had come out wrong. "I should have formalized your role 2 years ago. What you do is not what I hired you to do." She looked at him levelly. "No, it isn't. I want to fix that. Now isn't the time." "No," he agreed, "but after." She held his gaze. "After," she said, and turned back to the pages. The RCMP liaison arrived at 10. Raphael had contacts. Of course he did. Because Raphael had contacts the way some people had furniture, simply accumulated over years of operating at the level where such things were practical rather than impressive. The woman who came was in her mid-40s, dark hair cut close, the specific quality of stillness that came from a career of reading rooms before walking into them. Her name was Inspector Delorme. Nadia walked her through the analysis. She did it standing, at the whiteboard in Raphael's office, because she found she thought better on her feet, and also because it was her work, and she intended it to be unmistakable that it was her work. She walked through the port data, the shell structure, the rotating manifests, the 6-year timeline, the specific mechanism by which Voss Capital was to be inserted as a legitimizing layer. Inspector Delorme asked 4 questions. They were good questions. Nadia answered them. When she was done, the inspector looked at Raphael. "Your operations coordinator," she said, the word carrying a faint inflection. Has done in 3 days what a joint task force has been attempting for 8 months. She tends to do that, Raphael said. He was leaning against the wall behind Nadia, and he said it without irony, without the practiced neutrality of a man managing expectations. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true. Nadia did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the inspector. But she felt it, the way you feel warmth from a window without turning toward it. The RCMP moved quickly after that. Rousseau and Leroy were detained at Pearson that afternoon, en route back to Vancouver. The wider investigation would take months. She understood that the complexity didn't collapse overnight, but the Carrington mechanism was disabled, its Canadian access point removed. The threatening call was traced to a burner registered through a company with ties to 3 of the names in her analysis. It would become part of the file. She was done by 4 o'clock. She sat at her desk and felt suddenly and completely how tired she was. Raphael appeared in her doorway. "Go home," he said. "I have the quarterly reports, Nadia." She looked at him. "Go home," he said again, gently. "The quarterly reports will be there Friday." She looked at him for a moment. Then she closed her laptop. "You're going to want to renegotiate my contract," she said. "When this is behind us, I mean significantly. I know that too." She stood, pulled on her coat, picked up her bag. She was nearly at the door when he said her name again. Not the way he said it in meetings, not even the way he'd said it at his kitchen table, but quietly, like it meant something he hadn't said out loud yet. She stopped. "The dress," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she'd catalogued on Tuesday and hadn't been able to name. "On Tuesday. I wasn't." He stopped. Tried again. "I wasn't displeased." It was, by any objective standard, an absurd understatement. She could see that he knew it was an absurd understatement. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. And then, because it was true and she was tired of filing true things under irrelevant, neither was I. She left. She took the elevator down 42 floors, walked out onto Bay Street in the early April cold, and stood for a moment in the particular silence of a day that had been too large to contain and had done it anyway. Her phone buzzed. A calendar invitation from Raphael for Monday morning. The title was Contract Renegotiation. Overdue. The description field, which he never used for anything other than agenda items, contained 2 words. Thank you. She stood on Bay Street and let the cold air in and thought about 3 years of silence and side doors and finding the thing beside the thing everyone else was looking at. She thought about a dress in burgundy jersey that had simply fit without apology, the way she had been fitting into spaces that weren't designed for her for as long as she could remember. She thought about a man who had said thank you in a calendar invite because he hadn't been able to say it to her face, without it meaning everything he hadn't said yet. Nadia Okafor walked to the King streetcar stop, stood in the cold without minding it, and for the first time in a very long time felt the precise, quiet weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be.